Well, rewilding, it only entered the dictionary in 2011, but it already has about 40 definitions. It's a hotly contested word. But I'm going to start by explaining what it means to me, which is perhaps slightly different to what it means to anybody else, because it's one of those words which accumulates meanings as it passes through human minds. And it first impinged on my consciousness, well, almost as a thought before I knew the word. It happened to me in Cardigan Bay. I was out in my kayak, in the usual stupidity of my kayaking adventures of going out in a force 4 to 5 with a 10-foot swell. A daft time to go out, but the most exciting times, because you have these tremendous complexes of waves where they come together and form great towers of water, which you then slide down into these troughs, or they cancel each other out and form little flat patches, and you never know what's coming next. It's tremendously exciting. But in this occasion, it was a little bit too exciting, because I realized that I'd actually taken on more or less more than I could handle, and that the tide had come up, that the beach that I'd launched from no longer existed, and I didn't really have an easy way back. And so I was sitting in my boat about 200 meters from the shore, watching these enormous breakers roll from under me, coming in towards the shore, and then hurling gravel like grape shot up against the sea wall, and picturing what was going to happen to myself when I tried to follow them in. And I was pretty nervous. I was in a state, I suppose, of heightened emotional engagement when I heard this horrendous noise right behind my head. It sounded like a huge wave crashing, and so I ducked, imagined that it was going to come over my head, and nothing happened. And I turned around, there was nothing there. The same sequence of waves was coming in under the boat and going past me towards the shore. They looked uglier and uglier, but nothing had happened. What was this noise? And then from under the shaft of my paddle, this great hooked, torn, scarred grey fin rose, very nearly touched the shaft of the paddle, and then went down again. And I was like, the water was quite murky. I saw only the fin. I knew what it was, but there was something inside me which were almost a primal terror that I felt almost as if I was under attack. And then that noise came again, and this time I turned in time. It was a bull dolphin, 13 feet long, and it came right over my head. And as it came down on the other side, it looked back, and for a moment, a split second, our eyes met, and I was looking directly into its eye, and then it disappeared again into the water, and I didn't see it again. And that moment, for me, was a moment in the true sense of ecstasy. It was a moment where I left my own existence behind and found myself in a different realm. That was what I wanted. That, I realized, was what I'd been looking for all of my life. Years spent in the tropics, roaming around in remote and dangerous places, years spent in the hills and on the sea and the rivers of my own country. It was that sensation, it was that enchantment that I'd been seeking. And it was very soon after that I came across this word, rewilding, and the two things just meshed straight away for me. That was rewilding. This re-engagement, this serendipitous, unexpected, extraordinary thing which just happened to me out of the blue, or out of the depths in this case, that for me was rewilding. And out of that, of the many definitions, two emerged which appealed to me directly. And one is a mass restoration of ecosystems, the reversal of the horrendous damage, the horrendous degradation that has been done to them for so long. We saw a few days ago that we've lost 52% of our vertebrate wildlife across the entire world in 40 years. The second was the rewilding of human life, the re-engagement with the natural world, but not just with the natural world, with the world that lives inside us, the world that lies inside us, the world in which we evolved and whose legacy we still carry around in our minds, a world which was rich in instinct and emotion, a world which was rich in terror and fascination, the world in which we evolved, where we were surrounded by terrifying beasts and extraordinary beasts. I mean, the hominins of East Africa, they contended not only with the leopards and lions and hyenas that we know today, but with saber-tooths, with false saber-tooth, with giant hyenas, with amphicyonids, bear dogs with this enormous bite radius. That we have all that inside us, and yet we lead these small and shuffling and contained and managed and ordered lives. And I don't know about the rest of you, but for me it is not enough. And after meeting that dolphin, because that's how I saw it, my sense was that what I wanted was to reconnect not only with the natural world in a way that had almost been forbidden to me in this country where there are so few opportunities to do so, but also to reconnect with that thing that lies inside me, and the thing which I believe lies inside all of us, but that we very seldom see. And I felt that much of the frustration and sense of confinement and containment that I often feel is a symptom of ecological boredom. That we who evolved in a world of horns and tusks and fangs and claws must contend with a life so dull because civilization actually is really boring. That the greatest physical challenge we encounter is opening a badly designed packet of nuts. And that by rewilding the land and the sea, by the mass restoration of ecosystems, by enabling them to find their own way once more, by taking them out of the control and management of human beings, I could once more connect with that thing inside of me which would release me from ecological boredom. And I realized very quickly that even where I was living in pretty well the wildest part of Wales, and I'd moved there because it was the wildest part of Wales, had so few opportunities for that re-engagement and re-enchantment that I might as well still have been in the city. There I was, living between Snowdonia on the one side and the Cambrian Mountains on the other side, imagining when I first moved there that I was moving into this rich and intriguing and complex ecosystem, finding that I'd moved into the middle of a wet desert. A wet desert of the kind that you'll find all over Scotland as well. That the hills, the infertile land where you would expect to see the most wildlife, because that's the land which is least suitable for farming, where productivity is extremely low. In fact, the damage you do to watersheds and soils and the rest of it greatly outweighs any production that you can get from those hills. Those are the very places where there is the least wildlife. I mean, you can go through the arable wastelands of East Anglia and see a greater variety and number of birds than you will in most of the scoured highlands of Britain. An extraordinary thing. I mean, there in mid Wales, I could walk for the whole day and see a couple of carrion crows. That was all the bird life. There were no mammals apart from sodding sheep. There were no insects. This was an extraordinary thing. No insects. A land without insects. How on earth did we engineer that? Apart from grass, there were no vascular plants. Amazing. These treeless deserts, which we have created out of what was once a forested and complex landscape, in which there is no point of connection. There is nothing to shake you out of that ordered and scoured and regulated and very boring and very confined world in which we live, a world in which we consider ourselves free, but we are, in fact, powerless. We're technically free, but we are powerless. We are constantly at the beck and call of our employers, of government, of the constraints of our lives, the constraints that we impose on our lives, even when we have a measure of technical freedom, we spend it sitting on the sofa watching other people jumping up and down and screaming. We have become so unfree as almost in this land of extraordinary but hideously poorly distributed prosperity, almost to have reduced ourselves to the status of captives. And when we try to step out of that, when we go into the hills, which traditionally is a place where you escape from the state of captivity, you run to the hills. There is no let up there either. In Scotland, you go into the hills and you're instantly in the domain of the big estates, some of the richest and most powerful people in Britain, who destroy the land, systematically destroy the land, not even for an economic reason, but purely for the sporting interest, or so it's called, of a few thousand people. At the very most, 1,000 people go deer stalking every year. The very richest people, people who have plenty of choice, plenty of opportunity to do whatever they wish to do. A couple of thousand people shoot grouse every year. Again, the same social category. And for this, virtually the entire land area of the Highlands is destroyed. The deer are massively overstocked. The hillsides are burnt to encourage grouse numbers. Burnt. Why is it acceptable in the 21st century to burn a hillside for any purpose, let alone to allow a bunch of plonkers in tweed pantaloons to shoot Highland chickens? And while technically we can walk in these places, in doing so, in these fenced and sterile and burnt and cut and trashed wastelands, we find ourselves no more free, no more enchanted, no more delighted, no more infected with the wonder of the natural world than we do when walking down the pavement. From my part, it's a profoundly depressing experience. And you go to sea, I don't know how many of you do what I do often, which is to go snorkeling off the British coast. And there are a few little pockets where it's fantastic, but the majority, as soon as you get offshore a little bit, and I like to swim out a mile or so and just keep my head down and keep swimming, it's the same story. It's this, you might as well be looking at tarmac. It's been so scoured, so perennially ploughed and mashed and destroyed by beam trawlers and scallop dredgers and all the rest of the heavy gear which is towed across the seabed, that it is almost entirely lifeless. There is what on both land and sea, there is almost a complete lack of what ecologists call structural heterogeneity, which means, roughly translated into English, a diversity of natural structures in which life can take root. And the great majority of all life forms require cover for their survival, to escape from extremes of temperature and humidity on land, of current and tides at sea, to hide from predators, to ambush their prey. And so the great majority of wildlife has no purchase at all in this remarkably scoured, polished country in which we live. In the uplands, the wildlife we fetishize is what biologists call R-selected species which reproduce quickly, put very little investment into their young, which are the only ones which can survive in open, bare landscapes. It's a very tiny selection of the potential wildlife that you could have in a country, but because that's what's there, that's what we focus on as our conservation priorities, and so even in conservation areas, we maintain the destructive regime in order to favour the wildlife that survives the destructive regime. And in doing so, we shut out a far greater range of wildlife than we protect. I mean, why? Why is it, and I don't exaggerate here, why is it that we have reserves whose priority is a moorland flea beetle and the climbing Coriodalis weevil, rather than the lynx or the wolf Why? Why are those our priorities? Why do we have such a remarkably constrained and narrow and unambitious and anally retentive and ecologically illiterate approach to conservation in this country? Apart from that, no complaints at all. It defies all sense. And when you challenge conservationists about this, the arguments you get are entirely circular. We say, well, we have to maintain our sites of special scientific interest in favourable condition, and that means that our interest features have to be preserved as they are, and the interest features are what were there when the site was designated. So if a nuclear bomb had been dropped on it, the nuclear winter is the state in which it needs to be maintained. And you say, well, why are those your interest features? Why? You look at heather moorland, for instance. We are obsessed in this country by heather moorland. We think heather moorland is the apogee of a healthy ecosystem. Anywhere else in the world, you see an ecosystem like that, pretty well monocultural, small, shrubby, perennial plants, pretty well all of the same species, all of the same height, and you say, ecological disaster area. It's a classic sign of a place which has been repeatedly cut and burnt, and that's all you get left at the end of it. And when you see that around the tropics, anyone would recognise that as a severely damaged and degraded landscape. Even worse, rough grassland. So what do we fetishise? Heather moorland and rough grassland. And in order to maintain them, even in conservation areas, there's a regime of cutting and burning. Imagine what Brazilian conservationists would think of that. Cutting and burning is the way we preserve our natural systems. A most extraordinary thing. And it's literally the case that while in Brazil you protect the rainforest from the cattle ranches, here we protect the cattle ranches from the rainforest. We prevent trees from encroaching on these degraded lands in order to keep the interest features in favourable condition. And why those interest features? Because those are the ones which support the key indicator species. These are selected species such as skylarks and red grouse which can live in those habitats. So you say, why are those the key indicator species? Because they show that the interest features are in favourable condition. You come straight back to where you started, and no one, until very recently, is asking the question, why? Why are we preserving this form of destruction? Why are we locking it into place rather than imagining something better, rather than trying to create habitats for wildlife that could be here? Why are we instead obsessing about the tiny remnants of wildlife which still remains? Why have we forgotten what natural systems can be? Why have we forgotten what the extraordinary experience of roaming through a forest, as you can do in many parts of the European continent, not knowing what you might see next, not knowing whether around the next corner there could be a wild boar, or a beaver, or a lynx, or a wolf, or a moose, or a bison, and that extraordinary thrill, that possibility of moments like my moment with the dolphin. And I had a moment just like that with a bison in the Bielefeld forest, where you come round a corner and suddenly it's there, and you and the beast are looking each other in the eye. This incredible, thrilling, transformative moment which speaks to that thing which is buried so deep inside us, that those vestigial parts of the psyche, those genetic memories, which are so important to us, which we deny at our peril, which we suppress and suppress and suppress, or exercise through playing computer games. Why should we not have that in our own country? What is stopping us? Why is it that at sea, why do we have 48,000 square kilometres of territorial waters in Britain, and 5 square kilometres of that expanse are excluded from commercial fishing? And that is it. We have special areas of conservation, the highest designation in the European Union for a conservation area in which scallop dredging takes place. The total destruction of everything that lives there is considered acceptable within a special area conservation. Why? What does the fishing industry know? Do they dispose of the bodies of politicians' opponents at sea? Do they smuggle in their cocaine for them? How do they have such an extraordinary grip on the political system that we can't allow more than 0.01% of our territorial waters to be unscoured and wrecked and destroyed by this very tiny industrial fishing fleet that we have. A tiny, tiny part of the economy. Let me give you an idea of what we've lost here. In 1776, Oliver Goldsmith described the arrival of the herring off the coast of Britain. You see this from the shore. They started off, as you know, you might know, the herring came in to northern Scotland, and then they would move round the whole eastern coast of Scotland and England, and then disappear off into the Channel after they'd rounded East Anglia. And you could follow the herring all the way down. And wherever you were on that coast, you would see a similar sight. And he described it as follows. He said the main body of the herring was divided into columns, each 4 or 5 miles long and 2 or 3 miles wide. The water was black with them. As they moved, they rolled up the water ahead of them. They created this massive bow wave. Behind the herring, you could see the shoals of cod, because the water in those days was clear, primarily because the entire seabed was stabilized by oysters and other sessile life forms, which both filtered the water column and prevented the mud from being washed into it. The water was clear, so you could see it all. Behind the herring came the cod, hammering into the shoals of herring. Behind them, the spur dog, the tope, the other small sharks. Behind them, the large sharks, the blue sharks, the threshers, the makos, probably, we now believe, the great whites as well. And behind them, within sight of the shore, hitting the shoals of herring, the pods of sperm whales and fin whales in British waters, a couple of miles offshore. We had humpback whales migrating up the Irish Sea. We had grey whales hunting in our estuaries, filtering the mud in the estuaries. We had gigantic sturgeon up to 18 feet long migrating up the rivers. We had a run of bluefin tuna, one of the best in the world. For about 30 years, the world record bluefin tuna was one caught a mile off Scarborough in the 1930s. It was. We had all this. We had at sea a megafauna. You go back far enough in Britain, we had a megafauna on land as well. You look at the previous interglacial, it had all our familiar wildlife. It had badgers, foxes, red deer, hedgehogs, magpies, crows, elephants, rhinos, hippos, lions, hyenas. That what is our native fauna. Everywhere on Earth had a megafauna. The megafauna is the default state of ecosystems both at land and at sea. And now the highest aspiration of conservation is to protect the moorland flea beetle and the climbing Coriodalis weevil. That's how limited in our aspirations we've become, and that's how limited we've allowed our own lives to become. Because if we cannot get away from this world which is killing us, which is stifling us, which destroys our creativity, destroys our vision, it confines us to a narrow psychic world, a narrow mental existence. If we cannot get away from that, in the hills, in the national parks, for God's sake, in the places set aside for nature, then where? Where can we do it? Well, you had to fly halfway around the world to find places which are in any way unfettered, which are remotely free, where the spirit can roam freely. Well, why should we have to do that? Why should we be deprived of wonder and enchantment and delight in our own nation? Why, when so few people own the land and they manage that land exclusively for their own pleasure, why do we put up with that? Especially in Scotland, especially when most of those owners are absentees. Why do you put up with that? Why in this country which is really beginning to discover its power, to discover its spirit, or rediscover its spirit, why do you put up with that? Why do you let them do it? Why do you go up there and see a land which looks as if it's been camouflaged against military attack because it's all black and tan where it's been burnt in patches for grouse shooting? Why do you allow that to happen when that could be a land of extraordinary wealth of natural riches, where you could roam freely, never knowing what you were going to see next. Because as Alan will explain, I'm sure, with his wonderful work he's doing, what happens when you allow the land to go wild is you don't know what's going to happen next. All sorts of extraordinary things literally come out of the woodwork. And you discover that there was far more there than you thought, and that far more begins to come in. And the large species, particularly like the lynx and the wolf and the boar, these keystone species, they drive the ecological processes which then create habitats for many other species to live. The beavers do the same. These are absolutely critical to ecosystem functioning. And an ecosystem which has lost the top levels of the food chain is an ecosystem which behaves in radically different ways to an ecosystem which retains them. And this finding, it's quite recent in ecology, this finding of widespread trophic cascades of ecosystem processes which start at the top of the food chain, driven by large predators, and then cascade all the way down through them, even changing eventually the soil type and the behavior of the rivers. It's such extraordinary findings that come through. They present a profound challenge to conservation, a profound challenge to the way we do things at the moment. And they force us to ask, why this and not that? But above all, rewilding is about us. It's about granting us that measure of freedom, allowing us to pass through a portal into a different world in which we can leave all the shit behind. And God knows we need to do that increasingly as life goes by. Perhaps even more importantly than that, it's about something else that is missing from our lives, not just the excitement and the thrill and the serendipity and the unexpectedness of nature, not just the wolves and the lynx and the beavers and the boar and all the other species that we're missing in this country. Something even more important, even deeper and even rarer, especially in environmental discourse. And that's hope. That's what we're missing, is hope. Everywhere you look, it's just destruction, destruction, destruction. That 52% of vertebrate wildlife which has been destroyed in 40 years was 52% of an already highly depleted base, where we'd already lost huge amounts of the world's wildlife, and we've halved it again in just 40 years. And you look at that and you despair. And if you despair, you burn out. And then you can't fight for the things you want and fight against the things you don't want. In fact, you can't fight against the things you don't want unless there is something you want, unless there is a positive vision of something better. As environmentalists, we've been very good at telling people what not to do. And we should continue to do so, because we're doing some really awful things. But we've been very good at telling people, don't do this, don't consume so much, don't travel so much, don't walk on the grass, whatever it may be. But we've offered nothing in return. And you can't keep a movement moving forward unless you offer something in return. You can take freedoms away, but you've got to offer freedoms in return. And what the vision we've been expounding is follow us, and the world will be slightly less crap than it would otherwise have been. It's not much of a vision, isn't it? But how about follow us, and the world could be a hell of a lot better than it is at the moment. So much more engaging and exciting and enthralling, and a world which can inspire ecstasy. A world in which you can find freedoms we don't currently possess. And in all campaigning, an ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair. An ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair. Hope is a great commodity in which we must trade. If we do not have that, it is almost impossible in a sustained fashion to reach people. And hope, as Alan will be explaining with the magnificent work that he's been doing as he explains that to you, hope is what rewilding engenders. Hope is what rewilding brings to us. It is one component of something which we desperately need, a positive environmentalism. Thank you.